Hello everyone, my name is Karen Fox. I am the Adult Program Coordinator here at the Pine Bush Area Library. On behalf of all of us here at the library, welcome to our Women in History virtual program. Since this year is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, we will be honoring some of the famous women of the suffragette movement who were so instrumental in making this amendment to the Constitution a reality. The 19th Amendment was adopted by Congress on August 26, 1920. This amendment affirms, quote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex," unquote. In a few minutes, you will experience a very unique reenactment as we meet and learn the stories of 5 amazing suffragettes of the past who dedicated their lives to ensure that American women would have the same voting rights as men. These suffragettes and other bold, determined women of their time fought a gallant fight to give women the opportunity to have a say in their government and all matters pertaining to important issues that would affect their own lives. Shortly, you will hear the stories of Lucy Stone, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Lucy Burns, and Alice Paul. These 5 suffragettes of the past will be portrayed by 5 amazing local women of the present. Some of these local women of the present are current or former officials who were themselves elected to their position by a woman who exercised her right to vote. Before 1920, this could not happen. Our 5 amazing local women of the present reenactors are Jessica Kempter, Town of Crawford Clerk, Jane Raskow, Town of Shongum Clerk, Gail Fisher, a retired public school teacher for over 30 years, Susan Barron, former Orange County Commissioner of Elections, and Joanne Keeler, Town of Crawford historian. As we listen to the role-playing of our present-day women, please try to imagine you are actually listening to the real suffragettes of the past. Imagine they are speaking to a live audience at the Pine Bush Library back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Our first suffragette to speak is Lucy Stone.
Good afternoon. My name is Lucy Stone. Thank you for having me here today. I was born on August 13, 1818 on my family's Massachusetts farm in West Brookfield. I was the 8th of 9 children, and as I grew up, I watched as my father ruled the household and his wife by divine right. I was disturbed when my mother had to beg my father for money. I was also unhappy with the lack of support in my family for my education. I was faster at learning than my brothers, but they were to be educated while I was not. I was inspired by my reading of the Grimke sisters, who were abolitionists as well as proponents of women's rights. When the Bible was quoted to me defending the positions of men and women, I knew that when I grew up, I would learn Greek and Hebrew so I could correct the mistranslation that I was sure was behind such verses. My father would not support my education, so I alternated my own education with teaching to earn enough to continue. I attended several institutions, including Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. After 4 years of study at Oberlin College, all the while I was teaching and doing housework to pay for her costs, I graduated. They asked me to write a commencement speech for my class, but I refused because someone else would have had to read my speech because women were not allowed, even at Oberlin, to give a public address. Shortly after graduating as the first woman from Massachusetts to earn a college degree, I returned to my home state and gave my first public speech. The topic was women's rights, and I delivered the speech from the pulpit of my brother's church in Massachusetts. A year after I graduated, I was hired as an organizer for the American Anti-Slavery Society. In this paid position, I traveled and gave speeches on abolition and women's rights. When my women's rights speeches created too much controversy within the Anti-Slavery Society, some wondered whether I was diminishing my efforts on behalf of the abolition cause. I'd arranged to separate the two ventures, speaking on weekends on abolition and weekdays on women's rights, and charging admission for the speeches on women's rights. My radicalism on both abolition and women's rights brought large crowds. My talks also drew hostility. People tore down the posters advertising my talks, burned pepper in the auditoriums where I spoke, and pelted me with prayer books and other missiles. Having been convinced by using the Greek and Hebrew I had learned at Oberlin that indeed the biblical prescriptions on women were badly translated, I challenged those rules in church that I found to be unfair to women. In 1850, I led and organized the first National Women's Rights Convention held in Worcester, Massachusetts. In the 1848 convention in Seneca Falls had been an important and radical move. At that convention, my speech is credited with converting Susan B. Anthony to the cause of women's suffrage. It is said that a copy of my speech, which was sent to England, inspired John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor to publish The Enfranchisement of Women. Some years later, I also convinced Julia Ward Howe to adopt women's rights as a cause along with abolition. Frances Willard credited my work with her joining the suffrage cause. I had thought of myself as a free soul who would not marry. Then I met Cincinnati businessman Henry Blackwell in 1853 on one of my speaking tours. Henry was 7 years younger than me and courted me for 2 years. He was anti-slavery and pro-women's rights. His eldest sister, Elizabeth Blackwell, became the first woman physician in the United States, while another sister, Emily, had become a physician as well. Their brother Samuel later married Antoinette Brown, a friend of mine at Oberlin, and the first ordained as a minister in the United States. 2 years of courtship and friendship convinced me to accept Henry's offer of marriage. I was especially impressed when he rescued a fugitive slave from her owners. She wrote to him, "A wife should no more take her husband's name than he should hers. My name is my identity, and I must not be lost." Henry agreed with the fugitive slave and said, "I wish as a husband to renounce all the privileges which the law confers upon me, which are not strictly mutual. Surely such a marriage will not degrade you, dearest." And so, in 1855, Henry and I married. At the ceremony, Minister Thomas Wentworth Higginson read our statement renouncing and protesting the marriage laws of the time, and announcing that I would keep my own name. Our minister published the ceremony widely with our permission. Our daughter, Alice Stone Blackwell, was born in 1857. I had a son die at birth. We had no other children. I retired for a short period from active touring and public speaking and devoted myself to raising my daughter, Alice. We moved from Cincinnati to New Jersey. I remember writing to my sister-in-law, Antoinette Blackwell, that for these years I can only be a mother, no trivial thing either. I had refused to pay property taxes on my home. Henry and I carefully kept our property in my name, giving me independent income during our marriage. In my statement to the authorities, I protested the taxation without representation that women still endured. Women still had no vote. The authorities seized some of our furniture to pay the debt, but it was publicized as symbolic on behalf of women's rights. After the Civil War, we became active again in the suffrage movement, and the 14th Amendment was proposed, giving the vote to black men. For the first time, the Constitution would, with this amendment, mention male citizens explicitly. Most women suffrage activists were outraged. Many of us saw the possible passage of this amendment as setting back the cause of women's suffrage. In 1867, I again went on a full lecture tour to Kansas and New York, working for women's suffrage state amendments, trying to work for both black and women's suffrage. The women's suffrage movement split on this and other strategic grounds. The National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, decided to oppose the 14th Amendment because of the language, male citizen. I, Julia Ward Howe, and my Henry led those sought to keep the causes of black and women's suffrage together, and in 1869, we and others founded the American Women's Suffrage Association. The next year, I raised enough funds to start a suffrage weekly newspaper, the Woman's Journal. I found working on a newspaper far more compatible with family life than the lecture circuit. I always told my daughter that I do believe that a woman's truest place is in a home, with a husband and with children and with large freedom. Pecuniary freedom, personal freedom, and the right to vote. The Woman's Journal maintained a Republican Party line, opposing, for instance, labor movement organization and strikes and Victoria Woodhull's radicalism, in contrast to the Anthony Stanton NWSA. My radical move to keep my own name continued to inspire and enrage. In 1879, Massachusetts gave women a limited right to vote for the school committee. In Boston, however, the registrars refused to let me vote unless I used my husband's name. I continued to find that on legal documents, and when registering with my husband at hotels, I had to sign as Lucy Stone, married to Henry Blackwell, for my signature to be accepted as valid. Most remember me primarily as the first woman to keep my own name after marriage. Women who follow the custom are sometimes called Lucy Stoners. In 1887 speech to the New England Women's Club, I said, I think with never-ending gratitude that the young women of today do not and can never know at what price their right to free speech and to speak at all in public has been earned. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Katie Stanton. I was born November 12, 1815 in Johnstown, New York. I was one of 11 children. 5 of my siblings died in early childhood. My older brother died just before his graduation from college. Along with my 4 sisters, we lived well into adulthood. My father was a prominent Federalist attorney who served in the U.S. Congress and became a circuit court judge and a Supreme Court justice. My mother was the daughter of an officer in the Continental Army. After losing so many children, my mother fell into a deep depression and was not fully involved in my childhood. My father dealt with my mother's depression and the loss of my siblings by immersing himself in his work. Most of the child-rearing responsibilities fell on my older sister. Growing up, I gained an informal education by talking with my father and listening in on his conversations with his colleagues. I read his law books and I debated legal issues with his law clerks. I quickly learned that the law favored men over women, particularly married women. I realized that married women had no property, income, employment, or even custody rights over their own children. After my brother's death, I was devastated to learn that my father valued boys over girls. This is what set the course for me to pursue changing these inequities. At that time, our neighbor, Reverend Huzak, encouraged me to pursue my intellectual development and academic abilities. He taught me Greek, and he strengthened my confidence and self-esteem. Unlike many women, I was formally educated. I attended Johnstown Academy until I was 16. I was the only girl in advanced classes in mathematics and languages. I won second prize in the school's Greek competition and became a skilled debater. Upon graduation, I had my first taste of sexual discrimination. The young man I was graduating with and who I surpassed academically went on to Union College, who accepted only men. I enrolled in Troy Female Seminary. During my time at Troy, I learned to look at everything from religious superstition and speculation to the solid foundation of science and reason. Though my early involvement in the anti-slavery and abolition movements, I met my future husband, Henry Brewster Stanton. Henry was the co-founder of the Republican Party, a journalist, an anti-slave orator, and after our marriage, an attorney. At the time of our marriage, I requested the minister remove the phrase, promise to obey, from the wedding vows. I refused to obey one of whom I was entering an equal relation. On our honeymoon in London, I attended the World Slavery Convention, where I met abolitionist Lucretia Mott. When we returned from our honeymoon, we moved into the Katie household in Johnstown. Henry studied law under my father. Henry, like my father, disagreed with the notion of female suffrage. 3 years later, we moved to Boston, where Henry joined a law firm. I thoroughly enjoyed the social, political, and intellectual stimulation that came with our constant rounds of abolitionist gatherings and meetings. Throughout our marriage, I took my husband's surname, but always signing myself as Elizabeth Katie Stanton. I refused to be addressed as Mrs. Henry Stanton. Because of unemployment, travel, and financial considerations, we lived more often apart than together. In 1847, we moved from Boston to Seneca Falls. Although removed from the women's movement, I thoroughly enjoyed raising our 7 children there. I stayed committed to my efforts of working towards gaining property rights for married women and ending slavery. I became involved in the community and established ties with like-minded women, and together we organized the Seneca Falls Convention. Over 300 people attended that convention, where I drafted and read the Declaration of Sentiments, which proclaimed that men and women are created equal. Soon after that convention, I was invited to speak at the Second Women's Rights Convention in Rochester, New York. This solidified my role as an activist and reformer. I was then invited to speak at the First National Women's Rights Convention in 1850. That's when I met Susan B. Anthony. Because I was pregnant at the time, Susan read my speech at the National Convention. That was the beginning of our joint work on behalf of women's suffrage. Single and having no children, Susan was able to do the speaking and traveling that I was not able to do. Our skills complemented each other, and our friendship was never threatened because of our opposing viewpoints. In 1862, we moved to Brooklyn and later New York City, where I was able to join Susan to advocate for the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery. Our opposition to the 14th and 15th Amendments, which gave voting rights to black men, but not women, led to a rift with other women's suffrage and prompted us to form the National Suffrage Association in 1869. As president, I edited and wrote for The Revolution, a journal for the association. I was an outspoken and political commentator who debated major political and legal questions of the day. In addition to my writing and speaking, I promoted women's suffrage in many states. I fought for the passage of the Women's Property Bill that was passed by the New York State Legislature. I was also actively internationally, most of the time in Europe, where my daughter and fellow feminist Harry Stanton Blatch lived. In 1892, I addressed the issue of suffrage before the United States Congress, speaking of the central value of the individual, noting that value was not based on gender. Although my views alienated me from some of my fellow feminists, I continued to support divorce rights, employment rights, and property rights for women. I had no objection to interracial marriage. In my later years, I focused more on writing than traveling and lecturing. I remained diligent and with the goal of gaining the right to vote and elevating the rights of women in society. Elizabeth died in 1902, 18 years before women gained the right to vote.
Good afternoon, citizens of the world. I've been called many names in my time. As journalist, Iola was my pen name. Princess of the Press was the name given to me by the newspaper establishment, and even Darky Damsel when I was carried off a railroad train for sitting in a railroad car with a first-class ticket. But the names I like best are journalist, educator, activist, and suffragist. My full name is Ida Bell Wells Burnett. I married Ferdinand Lee Burnett in 1895, who, along with Frederick Douglass, helped me start the Alpha Suffrage Club of African American women. I was born in Holly Springs, Mississippi in 1862, the first child of 2 sharecroppers, James and Elizabeth Wells. A year later, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, but it didn't matter. The lives of black people didn't get any better. I was a good student, and when I was 16, yellow fever took the lives of my parents, and I became the sole supporter of my 4 younger brothers and sisters. Although I didn't like the profession, I started teaching to support my family. As a young woman, I started writing articles in the church newspaper, The Living Way. And soon I was writing articles and part owner of the Free Speech and Headlight. Around that time, 3 black men who owned a prosperous grocery store tried to defend themselves against a mob of white men who wanted to destroy their business. Only the 3 black men were arrested, jailed, and then taken out of jail by an angry white mob and lynched. I couldn't understand the silence of the press and the pulpit on the horrors of lynching. This is what opened my eyes to what lynching really was about. An excuse to get rid of Negroes who were acquiring wealth and property. That's when I decided to dedicate my life to teaching America and the rest of the world about the horrors and atrocities of lynching. The crusade for justice was my primary goal. My first publication was titled Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All of Its Phases. After the publication of the pamphlet, a white mob destroyed my office and warned me not to come back to Holly Springs or I too would be lynched. I moved to Chicago and continued to write articles about the heinous mass murders in the South. While living in Memphis, I continued to travel the country investigating and detailing descriptions and the justification of lynching in America from 1882 to 1894. It was titled The Red Record. It was designed to inform the world and to recount America's history of lynching Negroes in the South after emancipation. I named names of men directly involved and exposed city officials who turned a blind eye. Even when a legal process was employed, it was more often hijacked or overridden. White Southerners felt they had to neutralize the threat of revolution, Negro domination, and uphold the virtue of the white woman. In the past 10 years, over 1,000 black men, women, and even children have met their violent death at the hands of a white mob, and the rest of America has remained silent. When Memphis was no longer safe, I moved to New York. I was invited to England and Scotland to arouse public sentiment about the atrocities of lynching in America. It was my debut into public speaking. Mrs. Catherine Embry's newspaper, The Anti-Caste, helped me spread my message. Since England had abolished slavery in 1807, I found the people, the press, and the pulpit more receptive to ending lynching there than in America. While in New York, I started the first of many organizations and political groups with black women to secure the vote and to protect the community against heinous mass murders. I hope you see how my life's work on the crusade for justice against lynching is directly related to the universal justice for all, and that includes women's suffrage. My articles in the black press were the perfect vehicle on the local, state, and national level to encourage black women to create organizations all over the country and spread suffrage ideas and strategies here and abroad. Unable to seek inclusion in white organizations, black women created their own. As opposed to white women, black women not only had to fight against gender, but racial discrimination, class, and segregation. Their vision was a universal one that included the uplift of their communities, and that included black men who received the vote in 1870, but whose votes were stolen from them due to Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, and literacy tests, or legalized discrimination. Black women sought inclusion in the national organization. The first major conflict was over race. Many white women sought the vote for themselves. The split came over universalists versus educationalist suffrage movements. Many northern white suffragists were racist and reflected the segregated attitudes of their white southern counterparts. They were willing to accept black suffragists in their own segregated groups, but not in the national organization. Most of the women in the national organization were middle and upper class white women, as opposed to many of the black women who came from a variety of backgrounds. While in Chicago for a speaking engagement, I met Susan B. Anthony, who founded the National Suffrage Association. Miss Anthony, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, were pioneers in the abolitionist temperance tempers or anti-slavery movement. At that gathering, a gentleman from the audience asked me, if colored people were so badly treated in the South, why were there not more of them that didn't come north? Before I could answer, Susan B. Anthony jumped up and said, I'll answer that question. It is because here in the North, we do not treat the Negro any better than they do in the South, comparatively speaking. Although in my youth, I found her to be a good friend, mentor, and a pioneering veteran of the movement, when a group of black women came to Anthony and asked her for help in forming a branch of the National Suffrage Association, she declined to do so. We did not always agree, and she never showed any resentment of my vision for the black community. However, at one speaking engagement, she said, I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ever work or demand the ballot for the Negro and not the woman. Despite these differences between Universalists and the educated suffragists, the struggle for the vote had some common causes, and there were many attempts at unity on a local level. In the 1900s, Josephine St. Pierre challenged white women to unite with black women suffragists for the benefit of humanity, but her words went unheeded outside the state of Massachusetts. Along with Mary Church Terrell and 60 other black women, I traveled to the first suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., to march with the Illinois delegation. But we were told to march in the rear of the delegation, so not to upset the sensitivities of the Southern white delegation. I refused. Either I go with you or not at all. I am not taking a stand because I personally wish for recognition. I am doing it for the future benefit of my entire race. I left the scene to give the impression I was complying with their request, and along with Mary Church Terrell, ran up to the front of the march and marched with the Illinois State Delegation. My organization, as well as many black women's clubs and groups around the country, helped the suffrage movement reach its goal. Our work helped pass the municipal bill in Illinois in June of 1913, which gave women over 21 partial suffrage. Even after the Stanton Amendment, as it was called, or the 19th Amendment was passed, I continued to travel across Illinois to encourage black women to vote and participate in politics. In spite of our disenfranchisement and active resistance against inclusion in the national organizations, we never stopped our efforts to acquire full rights of citizenship for all. Even after the passage of the 19th Amendment, black women realized the same tactics that had deprived black men of their vote were now being used to deprive them of their prize. The fight for the vote by black women started long before I became a part of it. From 1850 to 1920, the push for the universal right to vote was well on the minds of black women. The early suffragists demanded equal rights, the vote, and rejected the idea that only men could vote. The struggle started in 1850. However, little is known about us or our active participation. Many of us have been invisible as active players, but the voices of some of us have survived. The leaders of the national movement constructed a history that lessened the value and contributions of black women to the movement. Even my friend, Miss Anthony, who was more sensitive about race than others in the movement, determined which voices of Negro men and women were notable and authentic enough to be considered in the history of the movement. But I'd rather go down in history as the one lone Negro who dared to tell the government that it has done a dastardly thing than to save my skin by taking back what I had said. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you that in 2020, I was posthumously awarded the Pulitzer Prize for my outstanding and courageous reporting and documentation in my book called The Red Record, which chronicled the horrific and vicious violence against Negroes during the era of lynching. Thank you, citizens of the world.
Hello, I'm Lucy Burns. Thank you, Ms. Fox, for inviting me to the Pine Bush Library. I was born July 29th, 1879 in Brooklyn, New York. In my younger years, I attended Packer Collegiate Institute, formerly known as the Brooklyn Female Academy. In my college years, I attended Columbia University, Vassar College, and Yale. It was at Packer Collegiate that I met one of my role models, Laura Wiley. Laura was one of the first women to go to Yale. Following Yale, I became an English teacher and taught back in Brooklyn at Ameris High School. I did love teaching, but preferred to continue my own studies. In 1906, at the age of 27, I moved to Germany to study language. I studied at the universities of Bonn and Berlin for 3 years. My father, Edward, was very supportive of my education and financed my move to Germany and my schooling there. Now that I think about it, being 27 years old in 1906 and moving to Germany was quite an accomplishment. In 1909, I moved to the United Kingdom and enrolled in Oxford University to study English. It was there that I met Emmeline Pankhurst in 1909. She had organized the United Kingdom suffragette movement. She and her daughters, Christabel and Sylvia, were very active in the suffragette movement. I was so inspired by them. So as a result of their enthusiasm and drive, I left Oxford and stayed with them to work in the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, and started selling their newsletter, Votes for Women. I became extremely active in their cause to earn women the right to vote. My first arrest came while I was working with the WSPU in 1909. While in London, I went to many rallies and gatherings regarding the suffragette movement, and I got arrested many times. My friends and I, Alice Paul, Adela Pankhurst, and Margaret Smith, we tried on 2 different occasions to break into political meetings that were being held at a police department in a town hall. We did it by climbing on the roofs of the buildings, and we got arrested twice. That's where I first met Alice, at this police station. I wanted to gain entry so bad, I tried to get into the meeting by breaking the police windows. Of course, they put us in jail. While we were in jail, we went on a hunger strike, one of the first of many, and the guards were ordered to force us to feed us by putting a tube down our throats and pouring liquid in our stomachs. Alice Paul and I worked so well together in England that there have been historical comparisons made of us with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Now those are 2 women I really admire, working so hard in the United States for the movement. Alice served the movement in Britain as well as in the United States. In 1912, we returned to the United States. However, we were frustrated about the lack of movement in the United States. The National American Women's Suffrage Association did not care for either Alice or me. They felt that we were too radical, too militant, given our history in Britain. We felt we needed action to get the American women their right to vote. I was more willing to compromise with them than Alice was. She was a strong-hearted woman who spent her life working on the women's right movement throughout the country. Alice and I brought a very strong proposal to the 1912 National American Women's Suffrage Association. We were wanting to hold the Democratic Party responsible for not passing the amendment for the women's right to vote. The NAWSA felt our proposal was too stern and would cause difficulties with the party in power, which at that time was the Democratic Party. Our proposal would hold the entire Democratic Party accountable. We believed that the congressmen would be forced to take action or risk losing their seats. NAWSA did not like that at all. Even with the toning down of our proposal, they would still not pass it. But then it was agreed that we could hold a suffrage parade the day before President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. Onlookers who opposed the march turned the event into a near riot. This whole incident started our divide with the NWASA because they removed our funding for our congressional committee. The National American Women's Suffrage Association thought it was too risky. It was at this point that Alice and I decided and formed a group still associated with the NAWSA called the Congressional Union, a group that would seek out the congressmen to try to get them to pass the suffrage, the right for women to vote. I was elected as an executive member, and Alice was elected as the executive director. In April 1913, the National American Women's Suffrage Association decided to distance themselves from what they considered our more radical group. Alice and I continued to insist on keeping a relationship with the NAWSA, and after a time, they considered it and granted us an auxiliary membership. But trust me, our relationship still remained quite difficult. We went through a lot of turmoil between the National American Women's Suffrage Association and the Congressional Union. We were working very hard not to cause irreparable harm to suffrage. We confronted Democratic Party, but we needed to get the Susan B. Anthony Amendment passed. In the meantime, the new chairman of the NAWSA had endorsed an alternate amendment, which would make suffrage a states' right, not a national constitution amendment. In 1914, I was the first woman to speak before the congressional delegation on the Anthony Amendment, the 19th Amendment. I outlined the accomplishments of the Congressional Union. I was honored to have been chosen to speak because I knew we were still facing large opposition in Congress, but we did prove that the American women could unite as a voting bloc. The Congressional Union continued to organize and sent 2 organizers to each state where women already had the right to vote, to make sure that the women did exercise that right. In 1914 also, we continued to put forth effort into organizing every state that did not have a branch of the Congressional Union. As things progressed in 1914, we spent our lives going from state to state to make sure that suffrage became a national issue. There were many issues between the Congressional Union and the NAWSA, but because they wanted us to end our anti-Democratic Party campaign, we felt that they were unreasonable and that at that time we were unable to reconcile with them. I know they felt it would make the movement better if we were aligned with them, but we just couldn't conform to that. It was very important for us to change the hearts and minds of those that were not in favor of the woman's right to vote. Following all this turmoil between the 2 groups, in 1916, Alice Paul announced a plan to organize a woman's political party. Well, of course, I supported Alice, and in June of 1916 in Chicago, delegates and female voters met to organize the National Women's Party, the NWP. Alice and I were committed in fighting for women's rights, especially the right to vote. I served in many capacities in this party. I was the chief organizer, hobby head, newspaper editor, teacher, orator, and many more roles. I taught women how to conduct automobile campaigns, giving them access to drive. I taught women how to work with the press, which we did during the war years as well. We organized women to picket the White House and protest Woodrow Wilson. I also fought against World War I. I saw it as a war led by powerful men, that young men being drafted and giving their lives for little free will. During one of the 1917 pickets, I was arrested and sent to Algonquin workhouse, one of the worst. Alice Paul and I were in jail together and started a hunger strike. They could not stop me in prison. Along with the other suffragettes, I organized protests. After my release, this particular time, I was quickly rearrested following another White House protest, and at that time, all of us endured a night of terror. I called roll of those who were in jail with me. We were treated brutally. We were beaten. Our hair was pulled. And we were refused medical attention. I kept calling the roll. When they realized I wasn't going to stop, they handcuffed my hands together above my head and left me that way, hanging the entire night. Well, after the night of terror, all the women went on a 3-day hunger strike. They tried to entice us with bringing fried chicken past our cells. Well, that didn't work. The hunger strike went on. Because I was so obstinate and the warden knew that the woman would just support me and follow me, he moved me to another prison where I was ordered to be force-fed. Because I wouldn't open my mouth for the feeding tube, it took 5 people to hold me down, and they shoved a feeding tube up my nose. Oh, that was so painful, and it caused me to have severe nosebleeds. The historians say that out of all the suffragettes, I spent the most time in jail. In 1917, we had been told that the House Committee on Suffrage would not pass any suffrage amendment until 1920. But at the end of 1917, we were surprised to learn that the House would make a decision on January 10th, 1918. Well, it did. It passed the House on that day. So the women of the National Women's Party began to lobby the 11 members of the Senate that they needed to get it to pass in the Senate. Well, on June 27th, 1918, it failed, and we were devastated. In August of that year, we resumed our protests at the White House, and of course, we were jailed again. Each time we were jailed, the conditions got much, much worse. After we were released this time, we focused our attention on the November election to get pro-suffrage candidates elected. We didn't care what party they were from. What mattered was that they were going to vote for the suffrage movement. It cost Democrats the majority in Congress that year. After that election, there were a lot of tensions between us, the suffragettes and President Wilson. And he knew something had to be done. He needed to end the clashes of the suffragettes with the police because they were just getting more and more brutal. He finally requested that Congress convene for a special session in May of 1919. And on May 21st, the House of Representatives passed the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. And on June 4th, the Senate passed it. But we still had our work cut out for us. We traveled the country because we needed to make sure that a majority of the states would ratify the Anthony Amendment. And finally, in August of 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment, and we were done. I told Alice and other suffragettes that I was done. I don't want to do anything more. I think we have done all this for women, and we have sacrificed everything we possessed for them, and now let them fight for it. I'm not going to fight anymore. I was exhausted. I became bitter toward women who were married and didn't fight with us, nor did they fight for us. It's been 100 years since this amendment was ratified nationally. We struggled and we fought for this, for you, the women of the United States of America, to gain their right to vote. we are watching you from above. Women have come so far, but still have a long way to go. Honor us and those that came before us by continuing our fight for equality for women and equality for all. There is no better time than now. We always thought about Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and all the others that came before us, including Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass, who were abolitionists, because you see, equality is equality. In 1966, at the age of 87, I died.
Good afternoon. My name is Alice Paul. I was born on January 11, 1885 in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. My parents were progressive for that time, as they insisted I receive a formal education beyond the usual grade schooling allowed for most young girls of the day. As a result, I went on to earn my bachelor's degree from Swarthmore College, a master's degree from Columbia University, and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. And I followed this by earning a law degree from American University. In 1907, after earning my bachelor's degree from Swarthmore, and before pursuing my graduate studies, I traveled to England, where I spent 3 years working in a settlement house. It was during this time that I was introduced to England's suffrage movement. Protests took on more militant actions in Britain. During that time, I became a member of the Women's Social and Political Union, which fought for and achieved women's suffrage in England. This organization's more militant stance influenced my philosophy of action. I returned to the United States in 1910 to continue the fight for women's suffrage and equality. My most memorable action for women's suffrage took place during 1917 in Washington, D.C. Trying to bring attention to the need for changes in the voting laws was becoming more and more difficult. At that time, I was a member of the WSPU, or Women's Social and Political Union. We participated in numerous marches in cities and towns throughout the country, but to no avail. Most of our demonstrations were met with jeers from the public and dismissals from political leaders. On March 3, 1913, 8,000 women participated in a march down Pennsylvania Avenue. Even this huge action did little to move legislators to consider our cause. As a result, I broke away from the WSPU. I felt it was not militant enough, and more drastic measures were needed if women were to succeed and attain voting rights as well as civil rights. I formed the National Women's Party, or NWP. In 1917, over 1,000 members of this organization began a nonviolent action for women's suffrage. We decided to carry our silent pickets in front of the White House. We referred to ourselves as the Silent Sentinels. Our banners are displayed here, and the reaction by the public was far from nonviolent. We were spat upon, called vicious names, had dirt and rocks thrown at us. Our banners were ripped from our hands and thrown into the street. None of these actions were able to prevent us from acting or speaking in order to obtain our goal. And it's important to mention that this protest was the very first time pickets were ever carried out in front of the White House. In November of 1917, a group of us were arrested. The formal charge was that we were obstructing traffic. Hard to believe, since we were standing silently up against the iron fence on the sidewalk, not the street. Nevertheless, myself and 96 other women were found guilty and thrown in jail. We were sentenced to serve 7 months in prison for our actions. Fearing our incarceration would quell the fight, we decided to carry out a hunger strike. After 78 hours, the warden ordered we should all be force-fed. We were forced to sit on chairs held down by male guards and force-fed by the use of funnels, with feeding tubes that were forced down our throats, like this one. Some of the women nurses assigned to the jail were appalled by these actions and reported the treatment to local newspapers. As a result, President Wilson received scores of letters and telegrams from all over the country, protesting our treatment as well as support for the suffrage cause. He followed this by issuing a pardon for myself and the 96 other women arrested with me. Attaining the vote did not end my interest in social, political, and judicial reforms. In 1970, at the age of 85, I became involved in the movement to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. Even though it received successful passage in Congress, nationwide approval was not achieved. I continued to be an outspoken force in local and national politics until my death at 92 on July 9, 1977. You may have noticed this small metal pin that I'm wearing today. It's a pin I designed for myself and the other women who were arrested with me following our protest in front of the White House. After our terrible treatment and release, I felt we needed a reminder of our courage and perseverance. The pin is an exact replica of the door of our jail cells. I myself and most of my fellow protesters wore it proudly for the rest of our lives. I always regarded it, this little pin, as our badge of honor. Thank you.
We hope that all of you in our virtual audience today, especially the women, are feeling a renewed sense of empowerment. The women of the past whose stories were so wonderfully told today did so much to make this world a better place for American women. To all our ladies out there, please don't squander your right to vote. Vote this year and every year, and by doing so, you will honor the courageous woman who fought so hard to make your voice count. Thank you. We hope you all enjoyed our Women in History presentation.